started. My name is Erin Kopak, and I'm the Marketing Director for Extra Help, a workforce management resource. Today you have joined our Workplace Excellence webinar entitled Retirement Plan Fees, Are You Getting the Best Deal? We will begin momentarily, and I'll be introducing Philip Cinderwitz. So the Workplace Excellence Webinars is an exciting program offered by Extra Help to our clients and colleagues to help manage workforce changes and increase your efficiency. The call will last about 1 hour. Everyone is set up in listen-only mode, so there will be an opportunity to ask questions towards the end of the webinar. So at the bottom of your screen, there is a question function, so feel free to use that and type in your questions, and we will review those at the end. So let's get started. Philip Cinderwitz is a CFA shareholder. He works as a senior planning consultant and heads up the firm's Florida office, where he services both new and existing clients with focus on fiduciary best practices, investment due diligence, reviews, and provider benchmarking. With more than a decade of industry experience, Philip has served as Chief Investment Officer for Chimpanic Financial, Private Advisor at SunTrust Bank, and Team Manager at Charles Schwab. Philip is also a certified financial planner, practitioner, and accredited investment fiduciary. He is a strong adherent to his guidelines of the Center for Fiduciary Studies, a regular speaker at industry conferences, and actively serves on the board of several community organizations. So thank you for joining us, and I turn it over to you, Philip.
Thanks very much, Erin, and welcome to the call, everyone. Today we're just going to be talking a little bit about retirement plan fees and how to determine if you are getting the best deal. Now, what we're going to go over today is first, why should you even care about plan fees? And then walk through a little bit of trying to understand what different types of fees are and how they're charged. And then finally, how to determine if the fees that you are being charged are reasonable. So to get started, we want to just take a big picture look at the industry. And there's about 500,000 participant-directed individual account plans. That's what a traditional 401k plan is, where each of the individual participants can select their investments, but the provider is chosen for them by the employer. In those 500,000 plans, there's over $4 trillion of total assets. And fees have been in the spotlight for several years now, and they've been declining overall, but stayed relatively constant in the past year or so between 2013 and 2014. There's a wide variety of fees on the plans, and it's primarily dependent on the size of the plan. And so the average plan cost for a smaller plan declined from 1.46% to 1.44% in the past year, but larger plans, those with over 1,000, the fees remain flat at about 1.03% over that same time frame. Now, as you look at the further ends of the, both ends of the spectrum, you'll see even wider divergence. With a 50 participant plan with only 500,000 in assets, the average fee is around 2.27%, and investments make up about 3/4 of those costs. But as you get into the much larger market, 2,000 participant plan with 100 million, then the average cost is about 0.9%, and the investments make up almost all of that cost, 98.9%. So when you look at national averages, you have to be a little bit more specific about what you're looking for to get the full story, and using those averages to see if the fees are reasonable. Now, we want to talk about why should you care and how can you find out about those fees. The reason that you should care about that is that the vast majority of total plan costs are paid for by your participants. So even though the employer is choosing the vendor, the participants are paying for that. And that's why the Department of Labor is so concerned with those fees, because basically the employer can control whether the participants are paying too much or reasonable fees. Now, as we said, the plan pricing is going to vary tremendously based on the demographics of the plan. And that demographics doesn't just mean how big or how many assets are in the plan, but the number of participants, which together will determine the average account balance, but then also the service requirements that each plan has. If at a lot of hospitals, for example, there will be a representative from the retirement plan at on site every day of the year. That's a lot more cost than having only electronic access and no in-person education sessions. So the services that you're receiving will affect the overall cost of the plan. Now, it's incumbent on the plan sponsor to understand about the fees, and these numbers have improved tremendously over the past several years. Historically, plan sponsors didn't really understand where a lot of the fees were coming from, and now only about 20% of plan sponsors don't know about what the revenue sharing of mutual funds are used to pay for the plan, and about 3 in 8 don't know that some of that revenue is used to credit revenue back to the plan participants. We've seen a lot of focus on retirement plan fees. Largely, it was, first of all, the Department of Labor has gotten involved and is examining it more closely, but largely as a result of fee litigation. So plaintiffs' lawyers have determined that that's a ripe avenue for litigation, and there's been a lot of cases in the news lately. We're not going to go over them specifically on each one, but you can see there's 6 or 7, or actually about 8 really national ones. Nationwide settled for $140 million. Lockheed settled for $62 million. But I just want to point out some of the issues that these cases addressed. Tibble versus Edison really surrounded the fact that the company used higher cost share classes or more expensive mutual funds when institutional share classes were available. So they used more expensive funds than they needed to run the plan. Tussey versus ABB was a different situation where Fidelity was the record keeper of the plan and was using revenue generated by the retirement plan to offset corporate expenses like payroll. So basically the retirement plan participants were helping to pay for the payroll costs of the company. Boeing was charged with, again, excessive fees and failure to monitor their investments. Nationwide didn't disclose all of the revenue that they were receiving from the investments, and the rest of those really had to do with, again, excessive fees and imprudently managed stock funds. Hold on. Okay, there we go. So we want to look a little bit closer at retirement plan fees, and really why we want to look at these fees is that all retirement plans are governed under the ERISA statutes. And as fiduciaries of the plan, one of the jobs of the fiduciary is to monitor the fees. Now, a fiduciary has to act solely in the interest of the plan participants, the beneficiaries and the alternate payees, to ensure that reasonable expenses are paid. So it's not to ensure that the lowest fees are paid or that high fees are paid. It's that you're paying reasonable expenses for the services you're getting. Now, furthermore, and this is where we really want to kind of drill down, is that the process for ensuring that the fees are reasonable should be comprehensive, measurable, and documented. So pretty specific standards that ERISA lays out to make sure that you're able to judge the reasonableness of fees. A lot of things that you can really check the box on and document. Now, the second part of this is also very important, that the process should be done with the care, skill, prudence, and diligence that a prudent person familiar with such matters would exercise. So there's a couple points there that you want to look at, is that, first of all, that a prudent person, so someone that is really taking care to examine those fees, but also that someone that is familiar with such matters would exercise. So a lot of people have thought, oh, well, as long as I do my best, that's good enough. And what ERISA is stating is, if you don't know what you're doing, and saying I did my best isn't a good enough answer. You're expected under ERISA to be able to do or examine those fees with the prudence that a person familiar with such matters would exercise. So you are held to the standard of someone that knows what they're doing and does this regularly. So if you don't feel that you're able to meet that standard, you are allowed to, again, hire an expert to perform those duties. You can delegate that responsibility. So that's something that's important. You want to be able to demonstrate that either you have done the analysis with the care, skill, and prudence that a prudent person would do, or that you delegated that responsibility and hired someone with that expertise. So what are we looking at when we're saying we need to look at fees and whether they're reasonable? What considerations do you have to have? So first, overall, what are you paying? And every fiduciary of a plan should be able to, not necessarily off the top of their head, but quickly be able to answer the question, what does your retirement plan cost? If you're ever audited by the Department of Labor, I don't know is not a reasonable answer. You should be able to relatively quickly address exactly how much the retirement plan costs. Then, once you know how much it costs, who is paying that cost? You know, as we'll go into in a few slides, the costs can be split up several different ways, and the company can pay for some of the expenses, and the participants pay for some expenses. The only fees that the Department of Labor is concerned with are fees that are paid for by the participants. So if the company is paying the lion's share of fees, and the fees that the company is paying for out of their pocket are unreasonable, the Department of Labor doesn't care about that because that's up to the company whether they want to pay that or not. But if unreasonable fees are being imposed on the participants where they have no say in the matter, that is where the Department of Labor will get involved. Then we want to look at how are those fees going to be charged. And they can be charged a variety of different ways. They can be charged implicitly or kind of hidden fees, or they can be charged explicitly. And explicitly meaning charged directly to each participant. And then even beyond that, is it going to be a flat dollar amount, or is it going to be a percent of assets? And we'll see later how the difference between that can really impact the costs on a gross basis or on an actual dollar amount. And then we want to look at what model is best for the plan. Different types of plans will have different ways of paying for it, and they will work better for some rather than others. So we want to look at basically the whole gamut of fees to determine what is the best way to address that. Now we want to look at what exactly are those fees paying for. We want to understand what you're getting for those fees. And typical fees are going to be charged for record keeping, so that's, you know, how is the money getting into the accounts and whose money is it, what are they invested in. Technology services like the web and the phone center and processing online enrollments, compliance with all of the regulatory requirements, communications to the employees, you know, enrollment meetings, materials, advice, all that kind of thing, and then investment management, the actual managing of the money. So there's a lot of different services that those fees go to pay, and a lot of different parties involved with each of those services. You want to be able to identify each and every service provider that's receiving fees and whether each service provider is earning the amount that they are receiving. So when we look at the components of plan costs, there's really three main areas that you will see. There are investment fees, so those are the costs that are associated with managing the investment. So the actual picking of the stocks and bonds within the funds within the plan. And those are always paid for by the plan participants. So the expense ratios of the mutual funds always include the component for managing the actual assets. Then there are administrative fees that are services to operate the plan, the record keeping, the trustee, the compliance, the communications, and sometimes those are paid for by the plan sponsor, sometimes those are paid for by the participants. And then plan consulting fees are also charged to the plan, and those can be advisory fees paid for to a registered investment advisor or commissions paid to a broker. And again, sometimes those are paid for by the plan sponsor, and sometimes those are paid for by the participants. The administrative and plan consulting fees also sometimes are paid for either explicitly, where you will see a line item charge on the statement, or implicitly, where it's all wrapped up in the costs of the mutual fund. And we'll get a little bit more into how that works in the next slide. So as we look at a mutual fund, we'll just call it the ABC Large Growth Fund, we'll look at the components of the costs associated with that fund and then show a more concrete example afterwards. So what we want to look at is first, what is in the expense ratio? So what makes up the full expense ratio of a fund? So within the fund, you'll have an investment management fee, 12B1 fees, shareholder servicing fees, and sub-TA fees, or agency transfer fees. A lot of jargon there, but we'll kind of drill down in a second to explain a little bit more. And then we're going to see what components make up revenue sharing within the plan. So revenue sharing is money that is not used to invest the assets in the plan, but rather collected to offset expenses of the plan. And so money that is in the expense ratio that is sent to other parties. And those components are the 12B1, the shareholder servicing, and the sub-TA fees. The investment management fee is in that larger piece of the pie, and that's on the left. And that is the money that is used to actually manage the assets in the plan. So when you have looked in the paper and you see a whole bunch of different share classes of a fund and you say, you know, why do they have A shares and B shares and R2, R6, R4? There's all these different share classes of the same mutual fund. You say, I don't understand, why can't they just have one mutual fund? Well, the difference is just the expense ratio. So the assets within the plan are all going to be the same. And the investment management fee, so the amount that the company managing the fund receives, is going to be the same. It's this other component, the 12B1 fee, shareholder servicing, and sub-TA, so amounts that are sent to other people is going to change. So if you were to look in the paper, you'd see the ABC Large Growth Fund, and then you see three different share classes, R3, R4, and R6. So three different share classes, and you'll see varying returns. Over to the right here, you'll see expense ratio. So R3 charging 1.14%, and the R6 charging 0.5. And the difference in those expense ratios is accounted for by the fact that revenue sharing, so different amounts of revenue sharing, are sent to other parties. The R6 has no revenue sharing, so all of that 0.5% expense ratio is sent to ABC to manage the investments of the fund. This R4 charges 85 basis points, 0.85%, and 35 basis points, 0.35%, is used for revenue sharing. So you'll see 0.5 to 0.85 is a 0.35% difference, and that's the amount of the revenue sharing. This is off by a tad, 0.65 and 1.14, and that's really likely a result of rounding errors. But again, 0.5 to 1.14, and the difference being that 65 basis points being used for revenue sharing. We'll go a little bit more into the differences between these three share classes in a second. But you'll notice, why is the Department of Labor concerned with that? Because if you're a participant in the R6, you received 20.58% last year, where the R3, 19.79. Doesn't sound like that much of a difference. You know, they're both close to 20%. But with compounding in over a 20-year period, it can amount to thousands and thousands of dollars for each of the participants, just based on the difference of these expense ratios. So that's why the Department of Labor is so concerned with those fees. So if we look a little bit deeper, so the R3 share class, remember that was the most expensive, has the investment fees, that was the 0.5%, and then also included in that are administrative fees and plan consulting fees. So essentially there's money there to pay for the website and the compliance and the trustee and the communications, and then also some additional money in there to pay for an advisor or the broker that sold the plan. The R4 share class is a little bit less expensive, and that might be used in a plan that doesn't have a plan consultant or has a plan consultant that's being paid for directly by the company. And so just investment fees and administrative fees are paid for out of the assets of the mutual funds. And then in an R6 share class, again, only the investment fees are accounted for from the expense ratio, and then all other fees in the plan are going to be charged either directly to the company or explicitly to the plan participants. So now that we understand kind of the components of the fees, we want to look at what do you do with that. Once you know what your fees are, how do you determine if the fees you're paying are reasonable? And what you want to do is look at the fee investment and service benchmarking process. So you want to benchmark the plan on a regular basis and occasionally conduct an RFP. The difference between those two is benchmarking is really done with the intent of staying with your present provider. You're saying, you know, we're kind of happy here. We just want to make sure that we're not getting overcharged. And you will go out and contact a couple other vendors and say, hey, if you wanted to do this plan, what would you charge? Documented, of course, but basically the outcomes, the desired outcome of benchmarking is just to lower your fees, enhance your investment lineup, and maybe get some more services for the fees that you're paying. But you're not really trying to hold the provider's feet to the fire and really move the plan. You just want to make sure that you're paying the appropriate fees. A more in-depth process is an RFP, a request for proposal, where you're considering a new provider. You're going to contact more providers and do a more in-depth analysis of all those providers. And it might include inviting finalists, several finalists in to present to the plan. And then depending on the size of the plan, you might even go and visit the headquarters of the company and look at the call center, really kick the tires on an in-depth basis, and look at some DCP studies, which are kind of more in-depth client satisfaction studies. Now, what we want to really emphasize is that you're not going to look at fees in a vacuum. You're not going to say, okay, we're out there to find the lowest cost provider. What we want to do is, again, look at all of the components of the plan and make sure, first of all, that we are using those components, and then if we're using those components, that we're paying an appropriate amount for that. And maybe enhance, you know, keep the cost the same, but receive increased service, maybe more communication. In the past, if you only got 1 day of education meetings, maybe you would get 4 or 5 for the same cost. Or say, you know what, we want to use more technology services and reduce the communications budget, so you'll receive lower fees because you're going to use less in the service side. When you're doing an in-depth RFP, typically there's 5 steps to the process. The first step, meeting with your advisor or your selection team and selecting a good amount, maybe 5 or 6 different providers to send out an RFP questionnaire. Then receive those and then do an analysis of the initial responses. Once you do that, narrow the process down and contact some semifinalists, do a little bit more in-depth to decide which finalists you're going to want to interview. And with that final RFP analysis, select some finalists and listen to presentations. Typically, finalist presentations, you'll have the incumbent and maybe 2, at most 3 others. So typically at most 4 providers, because it's going to be a long day. Most of the time when you do finalist presentations, each competitor will take about an hour, generally an hour and 15 minutes. So if you're looking at 3, you're going to be spending at least half a day, probably 3/4 of a day. 4, you can pretty much write off the whole day for listening to different providers and their presentations. So, and then in order to do a benchmarking, what you need to have is, or to send to each of the competitors, is the plan demographics, how many people are in the plan, how many assets, what those assets, how those assets are invested, the summary plan description so that the providers can get an idea for the complexity of the plan. What kind of a match do you have? Is there cross-testing? Administratively, how difficult will it be to run the plan? The current service offerings, the current expense structure, and then the most recent 5,500. What you're looking to accomplish is have each, you want an apples-to-apples comparison. So you don't want one provider providing a bid with no education days and another one assuming that you're going to need 5 education days, because the costs are going to be significantly different. And what we try and do is stay away from the investment side in terms of looking at the analysis, because the investments are typically going to be selected separately from the investment or the plan provider. Looking at the plan provider, you're looking more for how are they going to communicate with the employees and the services offered, because the investment choices are going to be very similar across most of the different platforms. So once you send out the RFP, what will typically be done is we'll do a total cost analysis. So look at each of the funds in the plan and the amount of assets that are in that. And then what we'll do is say, okay, this is the expense ratio, and out of that expense ratio, what is the revenue sharing for each of those plans, to get an idea for what are the costs of the plan. So remember, this is the expense ratio, that's what the participants are paying, but 52 basis points of that is going to the plan provider to run the plan. So if someone were to say, how much does your plan cost? This is the number, really, the 52 basis points, not the 93 that you want to be concerned with. And then once you get that, what we want to look at is the net record-keeping costs per participant. So this is one way that we've done to look at it, where the $41 or $45, so this is the total cost, and then some of it might be a billed fee, so maybe $7 per participant, and then 41 is coming out of revenue sharing. Some of them might have lower billed costs, some might have no billed costs, but then you'll see that green is an asset-based fee, and so that's based on the number of assets in the plan as opposed to just a hard dollar amount. And here are the results that we've had of different size plans, and you can see as the plans get larger, the dollars per participant amount goes down, and then also some of the gaps that you'll be able to see, the savings realized, on a percentage basis. This is a $15 on 62, that's almost a 25% decrease in cost, even though it's only $15 a participant. Here we have a 50% decline. So there are some significant savings that can be generated through this process of going through an RFP, even if the intent is not to leave the incumbent producer or provider. So I want to take a couple minutes to go through just a hypothetical case study so you see what happens during an RFP and kind of the results that we've been able to generate through that. And so we had a client that was doing benchmarking really more for due diligence purposes and wanted to make sure that they were paying competitive fees. Hadn't been out to the market for a while, so they didn't understand or know some of the services that were available out there, and wanted to look at potentially improving the investment line. So this was a $50 million plan that had 26 funds and was a safe harbor plan, so it had a strong match. The cost of the plan was 53 basis points of required revenue. Out of that required revenue, 16 basis points was going to the advisor, so it was an employee and was also an employee of the incumbent provider, so it was an in-house advisor, and that worked out to be about $80,000. There was an ERISA budget of 8 basis points, so $40,000 allocated to offset other allowable plan expenses. Typically that'll be for an audit or legal fees, and then the remaining 29 basis points was going to the record keeper of the plan. So we sent out the RFP to the incumbent and then 4 different providers. We look at providers in a couple of different categories, either an asset manager, so they are in the business of managing assets, so that'll be something like a Fidelity or a T. Rowe Price or a Vanguard, where they have record keeping, but their primary business is the managing of investment assets. Some are asset gatherers, so they do some asset management, but for the most part, they're in the business of gathering the assets and earning some fees on some of it, but using those assets, using the gathering of that asset to generate revenue later on from rollovers, et cetera. Or open architecture, where the main business of the plan is just doing the record keeping of the plan. They typically don't have proprietary investment products, or require, they may have some but don't require the use of any of those investment products within the plan. So before we started this process, the plan cost was about 0.98% or 98 basis points, and the bid after the process, the incumbent reduced their fees to 79 basis points. You'll see one of the providers was in 59 basis points. The high of all of the other competitors was still lower than where the incumbent came at 72, and the average was about 65 basis points. So we were able to achieve we restructured the lineup to lower the share class for many funds, so reducing the fees within those funds primarily out of the revenue sharing. Since we were able to reduce the fees charged to the plan, we could pass that along by using cheaper funds of the same, cheaper share classes of the same funds. And so we saved about $100,000 just from the fee decrease from the plan. We took the net record keeping cost from $191 to below $100, or $104 from the incumbent versus 86 or 150, and the average was 114. So you'll see, while the expense ratio of the funds was a little bit higher, the overall fees were a little bit lower on a per participant basis than the average for the incumbent. So we were able to reduce that revenue requirement from 191, which is what the provider required, to 104, or 16 basis points. So we were able to save about 13 basis points, and that worked out to about $70,000 that was saved for the plan. We were also able to increase the performance of the investments and look at the ERISA budget, so the amount that was allocated to pay for other plan expenses. We revised that to allow the unused portion to be redistributed to participants. So historically, what the plan would do is say, okay, here's $40,000 to pay for plan expenses, and it was use it or lose it. So if they didn't use it, then the provider kept it. We said that's not fair, because that's plan participant money, and so we changed the plan so that if there was $10,000 left in that ERISA budget, it was reallocated to the plan participants, since it was their money in the first place. And we were able to generate savings of about $30,000 from that, primarily from reducing the advisor compensation to a $50,000 fixed fee. As the plans get larger, there's not a lot of difference in managing a $50 million plan versus a $60 million plan. But if you're paying a basis point fee, then you're going to be paying 12% more for a $60 million plan versus a $50 million plan, even though the same work is being done. And so what we typically see with mid to larger plans is a fixed fee on the advisory side, saying, okay, rather than 16 basis points, which worked out to $80,000, you're just going to get $50,000 on an annual basis. And if the plan goes up, it goes up. If it goes down, it goes down, but the fee is going to remain fixed. So action steps and what should plan sponsors be doing on a regular basis is understand the fees, monitor the fees, and document the fees. But not just the fees, the services and the investments alongside those fees. On an annual basis, what you want to do is just kind of see what's out there, get a general benchmarking of fees. Maybe it's documented, maybe it's not, but just kind of look around. Every 2 to 3 years, you want to have a documented specific benchmarking of fees and investment opportunities in the marketplace. And then every 4 or 5 years, do a full RFP documented process to understand specifically what's out there. Because a lot of times there's new services, new service offerings, and different ways of having fees charged that can really benefit the plan once you do an in-depth analysis of those fees and services. You want to make sure to include a comprehensive fund analysis as part of that fee benchmarking so that you're looking at the investments as well as the fees that they charge. When you do benchmark or look for the fees, you want to have a full and transparent fee disclosure. Basically, with the new disclosure regulations, the 408B2, or the plan sponsor fee disclosure, is the one that you want to look at both from your incumbent provider and any prospective providers you're looking for. Just taking a step back, there was a lot of the fee disclosure legislation that went out, and there's two different fee disclosures that people will talk about. There is the 408B2, and that, again, is the plan sponsor fee disclosure. That's a fee disclosure that the provider will send to the plan sponsor saying, here's all the fees that you're paying, and here's the services you're receiving for that. The participant fee disclosure is called the 404A5, and that is just a disclosure of the fees that each of the plan participants is paying, and typically going to show the expense ratios of the funds and then any hard dollar fees that are charged to the participants. But it won't show, for example, in a mutual fund, what % of the mutual fund fees are investment versus revenue sharing. So it's a bigger picture view. It doesn't break it down into each component of the fees. What we want to look at from a plan sponsor perspective is the 408B2 and the full and transparent fee disclosure. Remember, it's easy to just look at fees, and remember, all complex challenges have easy to understand wrong solutions. Oftentimes what we'll see is a plan sponsor saying, hey, we have the best plan because it has the lowest fees and it's using all index funds, and so as a result, that's the lowest fees. And that's not necessarily the best result for the participants, saying all or nothing with index funds versus actively managed funds. Our philosophy is to include index funds, absolutely, but also include actively managed funds and let the participants choose rather than taking a stance on that one way or the other. So I know that was a lot of information kind of thrown out to you fairly quickly. Wanted to thank you for taking some time this morning to listen to that. What NFP Retirement will offer to any of the participants on this call or anyone that wants to get some more information, if you can contact Aaron or myself, my email address is Philip, Phillip, .Senderwitz, SENDEROWITZ, @NFP.com. And for participants on this call or anyone that listens to the replay, we will offer a fee analysis. So we'll look at that total cost analysis and explain exactly what fees your current plan is paying, and we'll do that complimentary for any of the participants of this call. Now available to answer any questions from any of the participants, if Aaron wants to run that.
All right. If anybody has any questions, feel free to type those in at the question box on your GoToWebinar screen. I don't see that we have any right now, but we'll wait about a minute and see if anybody has anything come up. I would like to let everyone know that this will be available probably in the next 24 hours on our website. If there's something that you would like to go back and see again or hear again, feel free to check it out at www.extrahelpinc.com, and we put that on our company blog section. So feel free to see the recording there if you would like to replay it or share it. And I don't see that there's any questions. So we'll go ahead and wrap up. I appreciate everyone taking the time this morning to attend our webinar. We do have another one coming up next month, and it is regarding video and social media for your business. So a little bit of a different topic. Feel free to contact me. My email is ekopec@extrahelpinc.com if you would like to register or have any questions about today's webinar. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Philip.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day.